What if there really weren't any tension between Christian faith and culture? What if Christian faith, in fact, affirmed the very best and highest culture has to offer? It would make life a whole lot easier, wouldn't it? But is it the truth? Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. And this is your daily devotional for Saturday, August 9th, 2025. Earlier this week and into next week, I'm looking at an important book by theologian H. Richard Niebuhr called Christ and Culture. Written over 70 years ago, it remains an insightful analysis of the history of the church seen through the lens of how the church has come to terms with the tension between the Christian community and the cultures in which it exists. Yesterday, we took a very brief look at the strategy Niebuhr calls Christ against culture. This approach tends to view culture as being the very opposite of all Christian values, and it locates sin as a cultural phenomenon, prodding believers to separate themselves from the world as much as possible. This approach represents one end of a spectrum in the relationship between Christianity and the world. So if one end of the church and culture spectrum is the strategy of separating from the world, the opposite end of the spectrum is a strategy that finds broad agreement between the teachings of Jesus Christ and the best and highest any culture has to offer. Turns out this is a more common strategy than you might think. It is what Niebuhr calls Christ of culture. Culture Christians can span the theological, social, and political spectrum. Today, in fact, we see this strategy at work on the far left as well as the far right in the church. What unites them is a belief that culture, or at least parts of it, coincide with the teachings of Jesus. Of course, the question becomes which teachings of Jesus and which parts of culture. But let's back up for a moment and take a brief look at the inner workings of this strategy. In the first place, they see in Jesus Christ a great teacher, even philosopher. If the Christ against culture folks see Jesus as a lawgiver, culture Christians see him as a moral teacher. At the extreme end of this strategy are people like Thomas Jefferson and other of the American founding fathers who were not what we would call Orthodox Christians, but rather deists. Jefferson, for example, produced a version of the New Testament in which he excised the miracles of Jesus, leaving mostly simply his teachings. Why? Because they do not accord with the best and highest of human reasoning. A child of the Enlightenment, Jefferson placed his highest trust in human reason. To the extent that Jesus confirmed the highest moral standards of human culture, Jefferson considered him a hero. But the rest of what Jesus did? Irrelevant to Jefferson. Culture Christians tend to focus on what Jesus did for people and on the realization in history of a kind of moral perfection. For them, the kingdom of God becomes more or less synonymous with the establishment of laws and institutions and structures within society that they believe best accord with Christian faith, whether or not there is any mention of these laws, institutions, or structures in the Bible. The Prohibition movement of the late 19th and early 20th century is a prime example of this. There's no prohibition against drinking in the Bible, but it became an important symbol to them. Listen to this passage from the Gospel of Matthew as typical of the kind of gospel to which culture Christians gravitate. We read, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. The kingdom is near, and the evidence of the kingdom is the humanitarian work that Jesus does in the world. As Niebuhr puts it, they take some fragment of the complex New Testament story and interpretation and call this the essential characteristic of Jesus, elaborate upon it, and thus reconstruct their own mythical figure of the Lord. It is always something that seems to agree with the interests and needs of their particular time. To which we might add, it is always something that agrees with their agenda. Let's look at two opposite movements within the church today, both of which can be described as culture Christianity. On the one hand, there are those who are influenced by the theology of liberation, a school which was born in Latin America as a response to the very real oppression of the poor. Liberation theologies and the impulse that they spawn identify political liberation and empowerment movements of the poor with the kingdom of God. For them, Jesus becomes a sort of new Moses, one who sets the Hebrews free from their slavery to the Egyptians. On the other hand, there are those on the far right who advocate for making American government, Christian government. These Christian nationalists believe that part of the purpose of Christianity is to bring the kingdom into being through control of political institutions, creating laws which do not appear anywhere in the Bible, but which accord with their particular vision of morality. Culture Christianity can be a very tempting strategy, but it always results in something far less than what its adherents hope. And at worst, it can become, instead of a utopia, a dystopia, because it still turns out that sin is real, and even those with the highest of moral intentions themselves are as full of sin as those whom they oppose. It is, as I say, a tempting strategy, but it never lives up to the hype of its believers. So next week we begin to look at three middle ways that Niebuhr identifies. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.